Okay, think about this for a second. At its absolute peak, the British Empire controlled nearly a quarter of the entire world's land and ruled over a quarter of its people. It was so massive that people famously said the sun never set on it. But how on earth did that happen? We're going to unpack that whole 400-year story, and believe me, the answer is probably not what you think.
I mean, it really is a staggering question, right? How did this one, small, often rainy island come to dominate oceans, continents, and pretty much whole centuries of history? Well, the first thing you've got to understand is that this was not some grand plan.
There was no secret master plan for world domination hatched in some London war room. Nope. It all started with something way more familiar: business. It was opportunistic, it was commercial, and it was driven by the simple, relentless pursuit of profit. So let's dig into this idea of an empire by accident. In the beginning, these ventures were a mix of private ambition and a little royal help. The crown would give merchants these things called royal charters, which was basically a license to go explore and trade on behalf of the kingdom. And the best part for the treasury? It extended England's reach without costing them a penny. Pretty soon, these early ventures morphed into these incredibly powerful engines of empire. So let's take a look at the three key things that really built this global network: corporations, trade, and of course, force. And right at the heart of it all was the East India Company. Now get this wasn't a government department. It was a private joint stock company where investors pooled their money to share the risks and hopefully the rewards. I mean, just think about that for a second. This business model created a corporation that was almost its own state. It could wage war, it could govern territory, all to make a profit for its shareholders back in London. It's wild. The second engine was the brutally but immensely profitable triangular trade. The logic of it was grim but simple, and it tied together three continents. European goods were used to buy enslaved Africans, who were then forced across the Atlantic to produce things like sugar and cotton, which were then shipped back to Europe for huge profits. It was a vicious, self-sustaining cycle of exploitation. And behind all the economic charts and shipping logs was a human cost that is just almost impossible to comprehend. This quote from Oladuya Equiano, who actually survived the Middle Passage himself, gives us just a small glimpse into that horror. It's a stark and absolutely necessary reminder of the suffering that fueled so much of the empire's wealth. The third engine was force, and the symbol of that force was the Royal Navy. It created this really powerful feedback loop. Trade made money, which paid for the giant fleets, and the fleets then protected the trade routes. This control of the seas allowed Britain to secure its business interests, fight off rivals like France and Spain, and basically project its power anywhere in the world it wanted to. So the really crucial thing to get is that these engines, the company, the slave trade, and the navy, they created the perfect conditions for a massive shift. This is the moment we go from trade to territory. It's the story of how a private company basically became its own country. And the speed of this takeover was just breathtaking. In less than 10 years, the East India Company went from being just traders to full-on conquerors. The Battle of Plassey, that was the real turning point. It gave the company its first major piece of territory. After that, it just outmaneuvered everyone, from European rivals to local Indian rulers, and locked down its military dominance. But here's the real prize. It wasn't just about the land, it was about the money. Getting these Diwani rights meant the private East India Company now had the right to collect taxes from millions of people. This tax money then funded its own army and paid for its conquest of the rest of the subcontinent. A private company had officially become a government. Okay, so as Britain becomes this global superpower, it starts telling itself this grand story, full of powerful ideals. But as we're about to see in this next section, The Price of Power, those ideals often smashed head-on into the realities on the ground. And this created this deep hypocrisy right at the heart of the empire. I mean, Britain talked a big game about liberty, but then crushed the American Revolution. It preached free trade, while at the same time forcing opium on China. It spoke of a civilizing mission, even as its policies led to rebellion, and it promoted virtue, while its whole economy had been built on the horrors of slavery. And all this eventually led to a breaking point. Just look at this number, 267,000. That is how many soldiers, most of them Indian sepoys, were in the private army of the East India Company by 1857. This staggering number just shows how powerful and maybe how overstretched the company had become. And it was this very army that was about to rise up against it. The 1857 Indian Rebellion was a brutal, massive conflict that shook the empire right to its core. And the biggest consequence? It was the end of the East India Company. The British government basically decided that a private corporation could no longer be trusted to run a subcontinent. So power was formally handed over to the crown. And this started the era of direct rule, known as the British Raj.
But even as the Raj began, the forces that would eventually tear the empire apart were already in motion. So let's jump to our final chapter, The Empire's Long Sunset, and see how 2 world wars brought this whole 400-year story to a close.
You know, people say wars are expensive, but this is what it really looks like. The 2 world wars were just financially devastating for Britain. It went from being the world's biggest creditor, basically the world's bank, to its biggest debtor. To put it simply, Britain went bankrupt, and you just can't afford to police the world when you're broke. But, you know, the impact went way beyond just money. The wars also completely shattered this crucial myth of European invincibility. Colonial soldiers had fought and died right alongside Europeans. They'd seen the so-called master race bleed and fail. This experience gave a whole new power to nationalist leaders who started demanding the very same self-determination the Allies claimed they were fighting for. And after World War II, boy, the whole thing unraveled fast. A huge wave of decolonization kicked off with the jewel in the crown, India, in 1947. From there, it just spread like wildfire across Africa and the Caribbean. In just a couple of decades, the empire was almost completely gone. So, what did it all leave behind? In our final section, let's look at A World We Made, the incredibly complex and often contradictory legacy of the British Empire. The empire's legacy, it is woven into the very fabric of our world. It's in the English language we're speaking right now, in the legal systems that many nations still use, and in the financial networks centered on London. But it's also in the artificial borders that still fuel conflicts today, and in the complicated relationships that continue through organizations like the Commonwealth. So, what's the final verdict? Was it a story of progress or plunder? Of civilization or exploitation? You know, the truth is, it's messy, it's complicated, it's contested, and for billions of people around the world, it's deeply personal. The verdict on the empire is still being written.